I'm going to give some information about the development of the farmer clusters in the UK. I was involved in some of the very early work with the pilot for the clusters, working with Peter Thompson, the GWCT's farmer advisor at the time, and Teresa Dent, who was our then CEO. My own involvement was limited mostly to helping with collating the data sets and supervising the GIS elements for the initial work. Since then, I've not had much to do with it, but I can at least give you some information on history, and I've been provided with some information to give latest developments. I can give an overview of its early days, how it went mainstream, and then where this work is going into expanding farmer clusters, both in terms of area and the level of cooperation between farmers. The cluster concept GWCT developed in the early 2010s. Inspiration came from several projects. The two projects that really fed into it was the Marlborough Downs Nature Improvement Area at the time, and the GWCT's Sussex study, which is our long-running study across several farms on the South Downs. The nature improvement areas were the initiative from the English government to support landscape level ecological connectivity and biodiversity. The Marlborough Downs NIA, which we helped set up, was the only one of 12 in the country that was farmer-led. The rest was a top-down approach. The Sussex study also covers 23 square kilometres and is also the location for a single large-scale recovery project for grape partridges run by the landowner, which we helped with. We had some knowledge of some large-scale up that way. Both projects inspired the GWCT to develop this concept of a farmer-led landscape-level conservation. These early successes from Sussex and the Marlborough Downs gave inspiration to government through Natural England and DEFRA to provide funding for a pilot project. 5 pilot cluster areas were established in 2012, 2013 to see how best to organise farmers at a larger landscape scale. Peter Thompson led this by bringing together like-minded farmers whose land bordered one another. These weren't disparate areas, they were close neighbours. Peter also then identified a lead farmer. This needed to be someone who was respected by both their farming know-how, but also their interest in some element of conservation. And that was important. The cluster would then be set up to work collaboratively across the farms and the landscape scale, and these initial clusters ranged from 10 to about 100 square kilometres. Each cluster chose its own facilitator. This was a local advisor. It was someone who was trusted by the farms and experienced, and the farmers were comfortable working with them. Often there were conservation projects already ongoing, so they knew them. Several were GWC staff, but we didn't impose ourselves on the cluster. All the clusters chose a facilitator that they were comfortable with and that they were happy to work with amongst themselves. And we know that some ideas of individuals put forward, and sometimes they were rejected and they chose a third party that they all had to work with. And the first meetings of the clusters consisted of getting the farms together as a group, often around a kitchen table, and having one or more large maps printed out that displayed the local biodiversity, the biological record centres, species data for their area. And then asking the group, what wildlife do you want on your farm? And from there, worked out how they were going to get that wildlife. And this initial kitchen table gathering was an important step. Many of the farms had never seen what species had been recorded on their land. They'd never been proactively informed. But it also gave them the opportunity to see that there was gaps in the data. They knew species in certain areas that were never visited because if surveys are taken from public footpaths, they were never seen. They gained that surveys were of use. They just go back to that. The pilot was considered successful, and the government set out funding to support and expand the farmer cluster, concept. The funding stream was available through the countryside stewardship and was termed facilitation funding the costs of having a dedicated facilitator. And the funding was on a competitive basis. Groups of farmers, usually working with the local facilitator, applied for the funding and highlighted which priority species they proposed to work on. And these species came from the species 41, the NERC Act of 2006, with a specific list. The funding lasted for 3 years, and most of the clusters, at least initially, were funded in that manner. However, it's important to note that there are, in reality, two streams of funding. The alternative to facilitation funding for a cluster was for the cluster to fund itself independently. And this can give the cluster more flexibility. Facilitation funding can't be used for one-to-one advice. Independent funding can help pay for baseline surveys and ongoing work to monitor change in the various metrics as the cluster develops. There are various alternative farm clusters who decided to use this independent funding stream often gained it from a variety of funds. They included a tithing system based on size of holding, a certain number of pounds per hectare of each farm, commercial support, and this is often water companies seeking to offset some pollution, some local pollution issue, natural capital funding, and some grant-making charitable trust. GWCT has worked with both types, although we see there's now a tendency for clusters to start with the facilitation funding and then move towards the independent funding after their first round of funding has ended. And this is especially the case when there was a multi-year pause in funding after the initial 3 years had ended. Now, just to illustrate some of the farmer clusters that we've worked with, here I'm showing two examples from the Martin Down Supercluster. This included Martin Down Farmer Cluster, which began in 2016, and the Allenford Farmer Cluster, the yellowish area, which was one of the initial pilot areas from 2013. And this supercluster formed around the hub, this red area on the map, which is the Martin Down National Nature Reserve. They all had a boundary in common, and they wanted to help expand the habitat and potentially the species that were on the Martin Down area slowly into parts of their own clusters. And the Martin Down cluster is concentrating on 3 bird species: hornbunting, barn owls, and grey partridges, as well as butterflies. The Allenford area is concentrating on hedgehogs, butterflies, and bumblebees, and rare arable plants. And the farmers are also interested in soil health and aspects of regenerative agriculture. While they're focused on the key species important to their cluster, it doesn't mean that they aren't also interested in undertaking wider conservation measures that benefit other species. But the key species were of interest specifically to them, and that helped tie in their thoughts and how they would take it forward. In terms of concrete conservation activities, Martin Down Cluster works in providing a wide variety, this list of beneficial habitats. All were directed towards species recovery. And these 90 hectares of predominantly stripped habitats are in addition to any agri-environment, agri-stewardship that they were already doing. This is the 90 hectares of additional habitat. Allenford Cluster has worked on complementary arable flora and fauna. Several of the farms in the cluster have historic records of international importance for rare arable plants. And this was a focus from the start. And they had managed to increase pheasant eye in particular from 1 plant to 65 in their latest survey. And lately, they've also been involved in the H3 project with Cambridge University, investigating the effects of regenerative farming. And that also monitors soil, winter birds, pollinators, natural enemies, and pests. Going forwards, farm clusters still exist and are still being created, but the newest initiative utilizing farmer clusters is a concept called Environmental Farmers Group. These take farm clusters a step beyond even the supercluster idea. These farmer groups can cover several clusters and are often based on river catchments or across large areas of protected landscapes. The initiation of these environmental farmer groups reflects changes in the financial support to farmers. One of the results of Brexit in England is the discontinuation of direct payment to farmers that was based on the area of land that they farmed, meaning many farmers have needed to explore alternative funding to support their farms, as many are not viable economically without direct payment. Although some funding is available from government for public good of biodiversity through agri-environment schemes, that funding is not as reliable as direct payment. Agri-stewardship funding also tends to be on a cost recovery basis to offset costs without an element of profit that farmers would like. The environmental farmer groups are also farmer-led and owned, but they're environmental cooperative. Although born out of the farmer cluster idea, they are typically much bigger, much more ambitious to help support the farm. They have a business structure in order to access environmental trades and the green finance element, which was beginning to grow. And they pull together the goals of several farmer clusters. And therefore, hopefully, they should get a better bang for the buck in terms of what they can do at scale. And because of this scale, in addition to biodiversity and species recovery, the EFGs are considering aspects of clean water as well as net carbon zero by 2040. The first environmental farmers group was launched 3 years ago, covering the Hampshire Avon catchment in southern England, and that includes the Martindown and Allenford farmer clusters and a few other clusters up and down the valley. And this concept is gaining a large amount of interest from the farming community. There are different farmer clusters or groups at different stages of development. Currently, there are over 630 farmers across the country who have either joined an EFG or expressed an interest in one. These known about holding cover sort of 215,000 hectares. So that's about 4% of England's farmed area so far. And these are the blue outlines, I believe, on the map. Now, the green boundaries are those, the green outlines, I should say, are those where trades for green finance and other environmental trades are in motion or they have grants to help develop these. The orange areas, they have a steering group sorted and are now starting to roll out to the individual farmers beyond the steering group. The red areas are in the process of setting up a steering group, so they're fairly early on. And the purple circles, they indicate where there is interest, but as yet no substantial movement beyond that so far. Now the aim that we have is to turn these ambitions into reality. And the GWCT is working on devising a political conservation plan that address the national goal on habitat provision and species recovery, but interpreted at an individual farm level that each can then get behind and move forward on. And that's actually the end of what I talked about. I hope that's giving you some idea of the origins and how it's moving forward.